Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our first video for the Advanced Fundamentals Lab Caddy project. Now, one of the first things that we're going to physically do with our pattern is we are going to cut it out. You will select fabric from wherever we're getting our fabric from for this project. You will need to cut out the amount that you need and take it to the iron and press it. Press it really well because you don't want any kind of weird wonky wrinkles in your fabric because that will warp and distort your pattern pieces when you go to cut them out. I have already done that step and did not elect to show you that because that would have been really boring. So what I've already done is, as you can see on my fabric, I have already traced out all of my pattern pieces except one. I have one more to trace, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Before I show you how to trace, I want to point out the tools that you need. Obviously, you're going to need your pattern. For the Caddy project, there are 8 pattern pieces total, and you will cut each one more than once, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You will also need a ruler. The blue clear rulers are my personal favorite, but you can use any ruler you want, whatever works well for you, because the patterns themselves do not include seam allowance. So we have to add that on, and we will do that with a ruler. I'll show you how in a moment. For this video, I am using a fine point Sharpie to draw my lines, and I want to point out that this is not the standard tool that we would use to draw on fabric for cutting for projects. I am using a Sharpie so that you can see the contrast of the lines on the video. Normally, you would want to use something like chalk or a water-soluble marker, Frixion pens, pencil, something that doesn't bleed through to the opposite side of your fabric and can be washed away on certain types of fabric. So I'm using a Sharpie for this video, but please do not use Sharpies on your actual project because this is not our standard use. There are some times that we use Sharpies, but this is not one of them, typically speaking. Okay, so let's take a look at our pattern first. So this is one of the more complex pieces, and it's got a lot going on here. So let's break down what's here. So the first thing I want you guys to see is this bit of instructions here. The first thing is a number. This is piece number 1. We have 8 pieces, so this is piece number 1. This says what the project is. It's our Caddy project, Advanced Lab. And this piece right here is the front and back of the bag. So that's what that is. We also have our cutting instructions. For this piece, you need 2 pieces from your fashion fabric and 2 pieces from your lining fabric. I have elected to do my lining in the same fabric just because I want the inside to look the same as the outside on this project. So I would cut 4 of this out of this fabric since this is both my lining and my fashion fabric for this project. And on the very bottom it says NSA. That means no seam allowance added, which means you're going to have to add that in order to have enough seam allowance to sew the thing together. Now I want to point out along the sides here, there's lots of places where there's these notches cut into the pattern. These are our notches for the pattern. They all look the same, but some of them serve different purposes. As a general rule, the notches serve the purpose of marking a location for matching up pattern pieces or matching up lines that we'll draw later. That's what most of these notches are for, is to match them up. The notches down here mark that these are our pocket lines. So the front and the back have pockets on them, and this is where we're going to line up those pockets later. So that's what these notches are for. An important thing to note about the way this is notched, when you draw it out, you don't want to draw into your notch. That's just the location of the notch on the pattern. That keeps this edge nice and smooth. I'll show you what I want you to do with the notch. We're going to mark it out into the seam allowance. But I want to say it more than once. Don't actually mark into the notch. Okay, the last bit that I want to point out here is this line right here. This is our straight of grain line. Now, woven fabrics have threads that go 2 different directions. We've got the straight of grain, which on this fabric is this direction, and the cross grain, which is this direction. The straight of grain matches the selvage edge. This line needs to match this edge. So I'm going to turn my pattern this way. So this line is going the same direction as this. And on future projects, you may be working with more complicated pieces. You'll need to very, very carefully line up the straight of grain with your selvage. I will actually, when I want to be super specific, I'll take a ruler and I will match up. So that's 10 inches here from the selvage line. That's 10 inches from the selvage line too. So I got that down nice and straight. So it's exactly the same and perfectly straight. I'm not going to cut this out right here. I'm going to scoot it over. Something I have done with the way I've laid out my pattern pieces is I've kind of, nested isn't quite the right word, but I have basically put them side by side so that there's no gap between my pieces. So I've got one piece drawn out here, a seam allowance, and then I'm going to put this piece next to it. The reason I'm doing that, and it's very easy to do on this project since this is a bunch of squares and rectangles, is it saves fabric. If you can kind of nest your pattern pieces because your straight of grain lets you do that, that's a great way to save fabric instead of wasting it. So now let's get on to how we are going to physically put this together. I need to grab my pins. One moment. Reaching from across the table. There we go. Okay. So you will need push pins if you're cutting on these tables. If you are not cutting on one of the tables that you can pin directly into, you will use your straight pins and pin through the fabric and through the pattern to keep it straight. Just be really careful if you do that, that everything stays nice and flat and straight. If you can, try to cut in here on these tables because it makes your life so much easier. One thing I forgot to point out on the pattern is on each edge, there's a plus and a fraction. That is how much seam allowance this pattern should have. It's not added in, so when I lay this out, I know I need to add 5/8 of an inch off of each side because that's the way this pattern works. So I'm going to show you how I kind of nested these pieces side by side. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure 5/8, since that's my seam allowance, from the cut edge on the piece next to it. I'm going to hold my ruler in place so it doesn't move and line up my pattern piece with that edge. So now I know this line that's between our stitch lines on these two pieces, I only have to cut through it once because there's 5/8 on either side of this line. I'm going to hold this pattern in place exactly there. My straight of grain is good, and I'm going to pin it to the table. I'm going to pin mine at the 4 corners. You really only need to, for these squares and rectangles, pin at the 4 corners, but if you have a more complex piece in the future, you may need more pins in order to secure everything down to keep your pattern from moving. The particular pattern that I'm using is also made of cardstock, so it's a lot stiffer. Most pattern pieces we have done in paper. Okay, so now I'm going to take my writing utensil. Again, I'm using a Sharpie just for visibility on the video, but on your project, please don't use a Sharpie. Use something that is not a Sharpie, one of the things I listed. So now that I've got this pinned in place, my pattern's not going anywhere. What we're going to do now is I'm going to trace along the edge of this pattern because those are my seam lines. We want those for how we put this together. In theater, we usually do all of those seam lines, particularly on patterns that have been self-drafted. Another thing to note too is this piece I'm supposed to cut 4 out of, but I am only cutting through 1 layer of fabric. Usually what we do here is instead of folding the fabric and then cutting through 2 layers, we don't do that. We cut through 1 layer at a time, we draw it out, we then take the second piece, flip it over upside down so that it's mimicking the cutting through 2 layers, and we only cut through 1 layer at a time. The reason for that is so that we can't guarantee that this fabric under here is not going to slide or slip or be wrinkled and mess up our cut. This gives us much more accurate cutting and for our pieces to go together better. All right, so I'm going to just draw right here along this line I'm going to be very careful that I stay right at the edge of this pattern, because this pattern, the edges of it is the finished piece. So I need to stay very straight and precise. Go as slow as you need to stay precise. All right, so now I have my seam lines. I've drawn all 4 edges, but I'm not ready to pull these pins out yet. I need to mark every single one of these notches. So again, don't mark in the pattern, in the notch. We want to mark on the outside edge in the seam allowance amount. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to do a little tick mark right there, big enough that I can see it. I have in the past drawn my notch marks all the way through the seam allowance, but you don't have to if you don't want to. All right, now I still don't want to take my pins out because I don't have any seam allowance. If I were to cut on this line, this piece won't fit together with the other pieces. So I'm going to take my ruler, and for the sake of this piece, it's kind of tight. I'm going to hold it very tightly. I'm going to move 1 pin for the moment. I'm going to find my 5/8 line, line it up on my ruler with the edge there, and then draw my seam allowance in. Okay, while I've got that 1 pin out, I'm going to do the bulk of this edge, holding my pattern still so that it doesn't go anywhere. On bigger pieces, you've got a little bit more wiggle room. I just like to use the long straight edge. Another option you can do is you can use the edge like this. So I'm going to draw my seam allowance line up here. I'm going to find my 5/8 line. I'm going to do a mark there, slide down, do that again, make a mark there, and you would make several marks all the way down and then line them up and match them so you have a nice clean edge for marking your cutting line. I'm going to actually kind of do the same thing right here, except I'm going to go in, just going to get my ruler in, I'm going to go in this way, find my 5/8 line, make a little mark that bridges the gap that's there, and draw that out. Okay, same thing here, match that up. All right, so now this pattern is fully marked as far as what I can do with the pattern attached to the table. Now this particular piece, remember I showed you, has pocket lines. We are drawing all of these lines on the wrong side of the fabric. This particular fabric doesn't have a right side or wrong side, but if your fabric does, be sure that all of this marking occurs on the wrong side of the fabric, because we don't want any of these notch marks peeking out any of your lines. If you accidentally draw them wrong, we don't want them seen on the right side of the fabric. So make sure you do this on the wrong side. All right, back to specific about this pattern piece. We have 2 pocket lines that match up with the notches here. So I'm going to remove my pins so that I can move this pattern. I'm going to slide it sideways so it's right beside, so I can see and reference where those notches fall, so that I make sure that I'm drawing the lines correctly, because on this piece there's 3 notches on the side. The bottom 2 are the only ones that need an extra line. So I'm going to take my ruler, match up the notches that I made on the side, and draw a line across. That gives me my pocket line. Just like that. And this piece is done. One additional thing that I have done for my own personal tracking on this project is so many of these squares and pieces look very similar. They're relatively close to the same size. So what I've done is, in the seam allowance, super important you do this in the seam allowance, I am writing the piece number, and I've been writing it at what has been the top of my piece. So here's the piece, there's the arrow, my words are going this way. I'm writing the number 1 in the seam allowance in this space, so that whenever I start piecing it together, it's really easy to tell what pieces are what, since so many of these look similar, especially when they're just in a stack on the table. So I have drawn all of this out. All of my pieces are done. All that's left to do is cut it out. And be careful as you're cutting to make sure that you are catching only the cut lines and not the seam lines. And that's it. So cut out your pattern pieces and get ready for the next video where we're going to start putting it together.